Let's go ahead and begin our study of the Renaissance, a period of incredible cultural and artistic flourishing centered on the Italian peninsula, lasting from the 1350s roughly to the 1530s. This would begin with the Black Death and the crowning of Italy's poet laureate, whose name is Francesco Petrarch. He personally tries to revive a number of classical styles of poetry. He even coins the term the Dark Ages, and he personally is very much responsible for this renewed interest in Greco-Roman literature and Greco-Roman texts. And it lasts up to Charles V's sack of Rome in 1527. Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor, and at the moment when he sacks the city of Rome, a lot of people in Italy consider the good times of the Italian Renaissance, this period of dynamic cultural flourishing, to be over. Perhaps even lasting as long to Michelangelo's death in 1564, Michelangelo being one of the most significant artists of the Italian Renaissance. Now, as far as the causes of the Renaissance, it's largely stemming from two things. One of them is the abundance of Greco-Roman manuscripts that are coming in from Constantinople. These texts provide the basis of new sources of knowledge, new ways of thinking about the world, and presenting an avenue for the cities of the Italian peninsula to return back to the heyday and the glory of the Roman Empire. Constantinople falls in 1453, so roughly a century before the end of the Renaissance in 1527, 1564. But while Constantinople was under attack from the Ottoman Turks, scholars had been fleeing that city and carrying with them both the knowledge of Greek and Greek manuscripts. And that would include a number of different Greco-Roman authors, Homer, Plato, Ptolemy, Aristotle, as well as copies of the New Testament in its original Greek. The second factor that causes the Renaissance is the incredible wealth coming into Italy through overseas commerce, centered mostly in cities like Venice and Genoa and in Florence, and from there going into cities throughout the rest of Europe, like London, Paris, cities throughout the Holy Roman Empire. But Italy is really profiting in a huge way from commerce coming off of the Silk Road. Silks, spices, traveling across huge, very long trade routes stretching all the way back to India and China. Venice and Genoa and other Italian cities are becoming incredibly wealthy off of this trade. And with that wealth came new opportunities to support new forms of scholarship and new artistic endeavors. And that's what produces this incredible cultural flourishing we would call the Renaissance. As an overview, Renaissance is actually a French word for the word rebirth. So it's supposed to signify the rebirth of Greco-Roman culture, classical culture. And again, it's lasting from roughly 1350 to 1550, maybe even as late as 1600 AD. And there's, along with the Renaissance, there's a renewed interest in Greek and Roman literature, and Greco-Roman culture, and Greco-Roman life. It places emphasis on the power of human reason, as well as advances in the arts and the sciences. And we would consider this to be the birth of something called humanism. So it's centered largely on reason and the powers of human reason, and that produces with it a cultural movement called humanism. It began in the 1300s in Italian cities, which had always been better off than the rest of Europe. Now, the first real figure of the Renaissance is this figure here, Francesco Petrarch, who lives from 1304 to 1374. He's the first real figure, and he's a poet who wrote love sonnets for his beloved Laura, who died during the Black Death. He personally coined the term Dark Ages, because it was in his opinion that the Middle Ages, that it was a distinct period and one that was marked by ignorance, superstition, and a lack of the kind of cultural sophistication that we saw in the heyday of the Roman Empire. He's considered the first modern poet and the first great humanist. He personally was well-traveled throughout Europe and brought to bear an incredible interest and love of Greco-Roman culture. He wrote letters personally addressed to Cicero, and throughout his entire life, he's trying to bring back classical Latin, rather than the Latin that's currently being spoken, say, in churches in Italy during the 1300s. He wants to bring back classical Latin, which he considers to be pure, more refined, and just better than any other form of literature then existing on the continent, though he personally writes poems in his native Italian. Petrarch and other figures are associated with a cultural movement called humanism. Humanism is pretty loaded, and there's a number of different definitions for it, especially since it's a term that gets used over and over again throughout Western history. In the Renaissance, humanism really really focuses on Greco-Roman culture and literature. Scholars during the Renaissance grew interested in Greek and Roman grammar, history, poetry, rhetoric, and really for their own sake rather than for their relevance to Christianity. During the Middle Ages, you do have some Latin texts like the Aeneid and Ovid's Metamorphoses, but people read those texts as a means to help them better understand the Bible and to really just refine their ways of thinking. If you remember all the way back to Charlemagne during the Carolingian Renaissance, you'll remember that Charlemagne encouraged his bishops and monks and priests to learn to read Latin literature well so that they would be better preachers and better interpreters of God's word. Humanists, on the whole, believed in the pursuit of a full, active, and meaningful life on earth. They believe that each individual has dignity and worth, and that people are rational beings who possess within themselves the capacity for truth and goodness. There's another variation on the word humanism called civic humanism as well. Civic humanism entails that the greatest good that one could do was building up one's city and one's reputation in the process. You can think of a Roman senator and what they would give their lives for, i.e., the city of Rome. Now, you may be wondering why I have a picture of Michelangelo's David under this section on Renaissance humanism. And it's because this particular statue encapsulates many of the ideas of Renaissance humanism that we're studying here. If you're not familiar with the story of King David, he's a prophet and king from the Bible and one of the forebearers of Jesus Christ. The most famous story that David is involved in is the story of David and Goliath. Goliath is this Philistine champion. He's like 9 feet tall, huge guy, comes out and mocks the armies of Israel and challenges the God of Israel and mocks God in front of all of God's people, and nobody goes out to fight him because they're too scared. Well, not David. David takes a couple of stones, he puts one in his sling, he whirls it around, and he throws it at Goliath's head, knocks Goliath unconscious, then runs up, takes Goliath's sword, and then cuts off his head. And everybody is absolutely amazed because Goliath is this huge champion, a man of war since his youth, and David is just a shepherd boy. But David doesn't play by Goliath's rules, and so he's able to bring down this huge monster of a man and save the armies of Israel from just complete and total defeat. So we've got a great biblical subject for our sculpture. In the Renaissance, most of the works of art are still Christian in subject matter, but you do have increasingly Greco-Roman themes and civic themes and things like that. The big point of departure, though, is the way that Michelangelo has sculpted his David. If humanism is a focus on man and on man's abilities, look at this sculpture here. Look at the attention to detail that Michelangelo has put down right to the muscles in David's arms and in the exposed rib cage on David's chest, and the incredible attention to detail in David's hair. You can also see here the idealized sort of look in David's eyes here. He's not really staring off at anyone in particular. He looks more idealized, kind of in the way that a Greek god would be sculpted. Hold on 1 second, I've got a photo to show you. This here is the Apollo Belvedere with pants. It's a statue that was discovered in central Italy, rediscovered in central Italy in the late 15th century. So that would be the late 1400s. And currently it's in the Vatican Museum in Rome. So this is a statue that Michelangelo saw and used it when doing his David. Michelangelo's David is a freestanding nude sculpture, much like the Apollo Belvedere, and his gaze is very similar as well. The last really interesting thing about Michelangelo's David is the direction in which he's looking. So the statue currently is in the Academy Gallery in Florence. It's indoors to protect it, but it used to be outside in the Piazza della Signoria, which is where it's the main city square in Florence. It's where the Palazzo Vecchio is, like the main civic building in Florence. But it was right there outside, and his gaze was looking off in the distance towards the city of Rome, which was Florence's main rival in the region. So you've got not only the elements of humanism, right, man's abilities, man's strength, man's dignity, but you also have that element of civic humanism in there as well. That Florence is a beautiful city, Florence is a powerful city, Florence is a city that is not to be trifled with, even by a city as great and as powerful as Rome. Rome and Florence are very close to each other. I'll show you in a map on just a second. So they're rivals in the region for dominance. And the placement of Michelangelo's David and the direction that the David is looking is a signal that Florence is a great city, one not to be trifled with. Also, the statue was originally outside, right? This beautiful statue that now people travel all over the world to see, and then they pay ticket money to go inside and take a look at it. It used to just be outside in the open where anybody could see it. Civic humanism is not about building up your city so it's the most powerful, but also about beautifying your city so that it looks good and people want to stay in it, want to live in it. They want to live for it. In the same manner that Roman senators and Roman generals would pay for lavish decorations in the city of Rome. That way, it's a place where people want to be and is the center of culture. Here's a map of Italy at 1494. As you can see, Italy is not a united country. It's not like England or like Spain. And this is going to be to Italy's detriment. All these different colors here signify what is basically their own states, with their own dialects, their own culture, their own customs. I mean, roughly they're the same. You know, there's some movement between these states, but their own dialect, culture, customs, and their own coinage. So these are things that are going to prevent Italy from unifying into what we would call a nation state, similar to, say, Spain and England, especially England. If you remember with William the Conqueror moving in and subduing the entire region of England, it used to be broken up into a number of small kingdoms, like on their own. After the Normans move in, that's done for. You don't have a similar process here on the Italian peninsula. Some of the minor players at this stage are the Duchy of Savoy, which is located here. It's on the border with France, and at one time or another, it'll be taken over by France. You also have the Kingdom of Naples to the south. Naples itself is a pretty huge city. It's one of the largest in Europe today, but in the 1400s, most of this is agricultural regions. So you don't have dynamic cities like you do in the northern parts of the Italian peninsula. You also have the Republic of Genoa, which doesn't have the reputation for dynamic city building that you do amongst Venice and Florence, but Genoa operates colonies all across the Mediterranean Sea and in the Black Sea, trading posts and things like that. They're certainly very wealthy, but they don't have the reputation of some of the larger powers like Milan or Florence or Venice. Getting to that, Milan, which is located right here, and its territory is outlined in a turquoise color there. Milan gets its strength from a number of different factors. One, the farmland around it is very fertile. It largely guards the Italian peninsula from invasion from France, but its close proximity to France gives it a valuable trading partner. It's also located on the Po River, which is going to flow roughly through there until it reaches the Adriatic Sea. So it's a dominant city. It's an ancient city, one that's been around since the days of the Roman Empire. We, of course, also have the city of Florence, the Republic of Florence, which we'll talk about in just a moment. You have the Papal States, with the main city being Rome, and you can see how close they are, as we talked about in the last slide. And lastly, you've got the Republic of Venice, located here. Venice isn't on the Italian mainland. It's built on a series of lagoons and islands at the mouth of the Po River and at the head of the Adriatic Sea. They also operate colonies and trading posts across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. They're another dynamic commercial power, one of the wealthiest cities in the world at this time. However, without a strong centralized monarchy, these wealthy Italian city-states are going to be in constant competition with each other, as well as vulnerable to invasion from outside foreign powers like France and Spain. To help maintain some semblance of peace, many Italian statesmen, principally like the Medici family and others, will work out what's called diplomacy, which is the work of maintaining good relations between two countries. And in the Renaissance, city-states like Florence and Siena and Rome, they'll send permanent diplomats to other cities in order to help maintain good relations. And what they're trying to maintain is what's called a balance of power. Every state is going to have its sphere of power, and if one state expands, the other states come together to try to stop them. So you can see across this map here that you've got a number of principal cities like Turin, Milan, Venice, Florence, and they're always in the center. You've got this territory around them that they control, and that's very purposeful. These cities are vying with each other, and basically you just have kind of these lines in the sand beyond which no other power is meant to cross. Similar to our idea today of a nation state, that you have boundaries. This is where this particular group of people live. Their government is located at this city, but we're to respect the territory and the sovereignty of other states. As far as the wars go, you have a number of significant conflicts. One of them is going to be the Wars of Lombardy, which takes place from 1423 to 1454. And in this series of wars, Venice tried to expand its power at the expense of Milan and basically engulfed the whole of Italy into armed conflict. The family that ruled Milan at that time, they were called the Visconti family, and they were just as ambitious as any of the merchant families running Venice at the time. And the Visconti also had the added advantage of being crazy. One Visconti duke ruling Milan executed someone who just had a dream that they poached one of his deer. However, the Wars of Lombardy are ended in 1454 with what was called the Treaty of Lodi. And this is signed in 1454. Cosimo de' Medici helped to formulate it, but it's intended to create that balance of power between the larger city-states on the Italian peninsula, namely Venice, Milan, and Florence acting together as allies. This only lasts for 40 years until you have the Italian Wars break out in 1494, and you've got a painting here from one of those battles, but they last from 1494 to 1559. And what happens is the Duchy of Milan, led by Ludovico Sforza, wants to get back at Venice and seize some of their territory. You can see the jealousy and the power politics playing into this, but they're trying to take territory from Venice, and they invite the King of France, whose name is Charles VIII, to invade Italy and seize the throne of Naples, which Charles VIII had a claim to. Milan allowed the French to invade Italy without any trouble, and Charles VIII seized Naples, but then he was driven out. Then his successor, Louis XII, seized Milan and Genoa and Naples, but then he was driven out by the Spanish king Ferdinand. And that's the same Spanish king who sends Columbus across the Atlantic. While we're going over this quickly, the idea really is to get a sense of how chaotic Italy's climate is. That foreign powers can invade Italy, the rest of Italy, if you have a disaffected power like Milan or Venice for that matter. There's not a unified central monarchy, and so many of the city-states are in pretty bad shape. in terms of warfare. They're fighting with each other, and then they're wealthy enough that other foreign powers like France or Spain want to throw themselves into the ring and scoop up some of these cities or territories if they can. One would hope that the papacy and the Catholic Church would set the tone and provide leadership during this time. However, that does not happen. The popes from 1471 to 1521 are some of the worst in the history of the papacy. The popes were fairly immoral men who had neglected the spiritual requirements of their job. They were really intent on using the lavish funds available and the incredible array of jobs at their disposal to reward their supporters and build up a huge power base. Some of the highlights amongst these Renaissance popes, and these are figures that are just like worldly princes of any other kind. They're not intent on using the church to, take care of people in Europe. They're really looking out for themselves and their own families. We can start here with Pope Sixtus IV, whose pontificate lasts the last roughly 13 years of his life. He's involved in a conspiracy to murder Lorenzo de' Medici, while Lorenzo de' Medici was in church at Easter. Also, Pope Sixtus IV gave everyone in his family positions in the papal hierarchy. Again, the papacy is used by these unscrupulous individuals to reward themselves and advance their own interests. Then you've got Pope Alexander VI, whose pontificate lasts from 1492 to 1503. He's a member of the Borgia family, which is just infamous for its immorality during the Renaissance. He's originally from Spain, but through a series of bribes, he was able to secure the papacy for himself, and he used it to secure positions for his children. He made his son Cesare a cardinal at age 18, and then took him out of the cardinalate and gave him control of the papal armies. By the way, popes should not be having children. He has a number of illegitimate children. He married his daughter Lucretia off twice to increase the political power of the papal states. Then you've got Pope Leo X, who is actually a member of the Medici family. He destroyed the College of Cardinals when they were about to depose him, appointed a new group to help maintain himself in power. He goes bankrupt, and he wants to build St. Peter's Basilica, so he began selling indulgences and church offices to raise money. This is what gets Martin Luther so angry that he nails 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. So this is the guy here, everybody, that institutes many of the illicit practices that Martin Luther and many other Protestant reformers were very upset with. But this is the guy right here that signs, the approval form to start selling indulgences at a huge rate. Oddly enough, some of the most virtuous figures from the Renaissance are people who are called condottieri. Condottieri are mercenary captains who commanded roving bands of men for hire. With all the fighting taking place between different Italian city-states and kingdoms, they need soldiers desperately, and they have more money than they do soldiers. So a lot of these mercenary captains would form, and they would fight for various cities, one against the other, and really fighting for the highest bidder. Machiavelli will have really burning invectives against the condottieri and against mercenaries, because you never get what you pay for. The first one that we'll look at is Francisco Sforza, who's a condottiere so skilled that he rises from being the illegitimate son of another condottiere to become the Duke of Milan. And he rules Milan from 1450 to 1466. During his reign, he formed an alliance with Florence that resulted in the Peace of Lodi that legitimized his rules. Some people look at him as something of an enlightened despot, since he was an absolute ruler. He's the Duke of Milan, but he also enriched the arts as much as he could during his lifetime. His children, in particular Ludovico Sforza, who was Duke of Milan from 1494 to 1498, supported Leonardo da Vinci, and Leonardo da Vinci in turn made weapons for Ludovico. Another prominent figure is Federico de Montefeltro, who lived from 1422 to 1482. He rose from a humble mercenary captain to being the lord of a small but great city called Urbino. And as a condottiere, Montefeltro is known for being very trustworthy. Most condottieri would switch sides at the last moment, depending on who paid them the most money, but Federico refused to switch sides or betray the Duke who had him in his employ once he signed a contract. And since he won, he could command exceptionally high rates. Back home in Urbino, with his wealth and respect, he could do favors for people who asked him and made time so that people could see him. He was conferred as Duke of Urbino from 1444 to 1482, and he built up a very nice Renaissance court. He was perhaps the ideal Renaissance prince. He was a fighter who loved literature and the arts and the buildup of his people. You can see here, he's reading a book, and he's got his helmet right by his side. This is his son, whose name is Guidobaldo, which may be one of the worst names of the Renaissance. But you can see here, his son dutifully at his side. He loves family, he loves literature, and he loves fighting. Before we go, let's look at some questions from the Renaissance. First, what is humanism? Are there different kinds of humanism? And if so, what are they? How did Italian politics change during the Renaissance? Why was it so chaotic and violent? What steps did political leaders take to control it? And who is your favorite figure from the Renaissance? How did they contribute to the Renaissance? Please answer these questions in time for class tomorrow. Thank you.